a bit unhappy about the situation because they are envious of Daniel. Because Daniel is going to be made the prime minister, and they are not. And so don't miss this. Daniel is going to be made the prime minister, and these other two who are also presidents, or these other two who are working with Daniel, are not pleased about it. And so what did they do? They decided to come up with a plan. Verse 4, if you go to Bibles, let's go to verse 4. Let me read verse 3 first. Then this Daniel distinguished himself above the governors and satraps because an excellent spirit was in Daniel, was in him. And the king gave thought to setting him over the whole realm. Verse 4 says, so the governors, satraps sought to find some charge against Daniel because concerning the kingdom, but they could find no charge or fault because he was faithful. Nor was there any error or fault found in him. So these men decided to come up with a plot. And the plot was to find some kind of fault with Daniel's work. But they couldn't find any fault. There was no fault in Daniel. And maybe the thought that comes to my mind when I read this text is this. Can people at your workplace say the same thing about you? Can they say, oh, I find no fault with Tom? Or I find no fault with Shirley? Because your work is done so well, that's perfect. Well, that's what they said about Daniel. They said there was no fault with him. Verse 5. Then these men said, we shall not find any charge against this Daniel unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God. Can you imagine? They said, all right, we can't find any charge against him. The only place we'll be able to find a charge against him is about the law of his God, or about his religion. Somebody asked the question, and you've probably seen this. It says, if you were convicted as a Christian, will there be enough evidence against you? Put it another way. Do your people at work or at school know that you're a Christian? Or are you trying to hide your light? Jesus says, let your light so shine before men, so that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. Do your people at your workplace know they're a Christian? Or are you trying to hide the fact that you're a Christian? Well, people in Daniel's day, or the people he used to work with, they knew who he was. They knew that he was a follower of the true God. So verse 6 says, so these governors and satraps, the name is so appropriate, isn't it? Satraps, they set traps, don't they? The satraps, you know? So these governors and satraps thrown before the king and said thus to him, King Darius, live forever. All the governors of the kingdom, the administrators and the satraps and the counselors and advisors have consulted together to establish a royal statute and to make a firm decree. And that whoever petitions any god or man for 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the decree and sign the writing, so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which does not alter. Therefore, King Darius signed the written decree. So they come to the king, they say to the king, King, you are so amazing. There is no king like you. You know, you should be actually worshipped. You deserve worship. So you know what? For the next 30 days, let us not pray to anyone. Let us pray to you and you only. And the king is taking it all in. Yes, I actually deserve to be worshipped. You know, the flattery is working. The king thinks, yeah, people should be worshiping me instead. And so it says that the king goes along with this trap and he signs the law. Verse 9. Therefore, King Darius signed the written decree. Verse 10 says, now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home. Was he hiding? No, it tells us. And in his upper room or upstairs, with his windows open toward Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times a day that day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom since early days. So this is what Daniel used to do. He used to pray 3 times a day. Now, when they signed the law and said nobody should pray to anyone else except the king for 30 days, Daniel did not say, oh, this is going to be a bit of a problem, so I'm going to put my prayer life on hold. He didn't say that. He still carried on and continued to pray as he had always done before. The reason why maybe this is important is this. The question we need to reflect on this morning, or one of the questions is how is your prayer life? Is your prayer life conditional upon how much time you have in the morning? Is your prayer life dependent on your schedule, how busy you are? Because if Daniel had said, well, you know what? At this time, it is inconvenient to be praying because my life could be on the line. Then it would have been some kind of a sellout. We get up in the morning and sometimes we're so busy, isn't it? So we get up in the morning and rush. And oftentimes we don't spend time getting to hear what the Lord has to say to us. But Daniel wasn't afraid, even though the law was signed. He says he continued to pray morning, afternoon, and evening. In Psalm 55, verse 17, he says, at evening, morning, and at noon will you hear my voice. So Daniel was used to praying 3 times a day. That doesn't mean that we should pray only 3 times a day. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 17, what does it say? It says, pray without what? Ceasing. So that means at work, at school, or wherever you are, you could be talking to the Lord all day. And so Daniel, his prayer life was not incidental. It was essential. Did you catch that? Daniel's prayer life was not incidental. It was essential. In other words, his life depended on it. And that's exactly what happened. He continued to pray in spite of the law that had been passed. Let's keep going. Verse 11. You got your Bibles? Verse 11. Then these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. Verse 12. And they went before the king and spoke concerning the king's decree. Have you not signed a decree that every man who petitions any god or man within 30 days except you, O king, shall be cast into the lion's den? The king answered and said, the thing is true according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which does not change, which does not alter. Verse 13. So they answered and said before the king, that Daniel, who is one of the captives from Judah, does not show due regard for you, O king, or for the decree that you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. Now, isn't it interesting that when they actually decide to report Daniel to the king, they don't say, well, one of the gentlemen you're thinking of making the prime minister, one of our fellow officers. No, they didn't say that. They said that Daniel, who is one of the captives from Judah. It tells you that they did not like Daniel. Verse 14, and the king, when he heard these words, was greatly displeased with himself and set his heart on Daniel to deliver him. And he labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him. And the king realized that now it was actually a trap. He had been deceived. He was thinking that the law was to honor him. But no, the law was not to honor him. The law was to actually get Daniel into the lion's den. And so the king realized that he had been taken for granted. And so the Bible says that the king labored from morning up until night, trying to find a way to release Daniel. So he probably called all the lawyers and all the people who knew about the law to try and find a way so that Daniel will be free. But they said to him, King, this is the law of the Medes and the Persians. It does not change. You cannot change the law. And so the king tried and was not able to change the law. Verse 15. Then these men approached the king and said to the king, know, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and the Persians that no decree or statute which a king establishes may be changed. So the king gave the command, verse 16, and they brought Daniel and cast him into the den of lions. But the king spoke, saying to Daniel, your God, whom you serve continually, he will deliver you. Did you catch that? Your God whom you serve what? Are you with me? Your God whom you serve continually. He will what? He will deliver you. Now, when I read this, I noticed that the king did not say, your God whom you serve on a part-time basis. Your God whom you serve when it is convenient. Or your God whom you serve on a contractual basis. You know, when you serve God on a part-time basis, on a contractual basis, you know what it's like? Lord, I'll do this for you if you give me a sign. Lord, I'll be obedient to you if you do X. Lord, if you help me do this, then I will do that. But the question is, what if God doesn't come through? Well, what if God does not sign the contract? Then are you going to say, well, Lord, then because you did not come through for me here, then I'm not going to be obedient to you there? The king realized that Daniel served his God continually. It wasn't a part-time or sometime or off-time or whenever. It was basically a continual basis that he served his God on a continual basis. Verse 17. Then a stone, verse 16 actually. So the king gave the command and he brought Daniel and cast him into the den of lions. But the king spoke, saying to Daniel, your God whom you serve continually, he will be able to deliver you. Verse 17. Then a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den. And the king sealed it with his own signet ring and the signets of his lords, that the purpose concerning Daniel might not be changed. So they put Daniel in the den of lions and they sealed it. They put a stone in front of it and then they sealed it to make sure that Daniel does not get out. The people made sure, and the king sealed it so that Daniel will not get out of the tomb, out of the den. Now that's really tragic. To know that you're serving God, and because you're serving God, you're going to be punished like this. You're serving God, and because you're serving God, you're going to be thrown into a lion's den. Well, let's keep reading. Verse 18. Now the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting, and no musicians were brought before him, and his sleep went from him. Now, can you imagine what's happening? The king couldn't sleep because he was thinking about Daniel and thinking about the deception that had been practiced on him. And he's thinking, is Daniel going to say, is he going to live? So the king was restless all night, tossing and turning. He wasn't comfortable. All the musicians that usually play for the king at night, he said, no music tonight. No food tonight. Tonight, he was in sorrow and he was tossing and turning on his bed. Meanwhile, Daniel is in the lion's den, and guess what? He's fast asleep. Isn't that interesting? So the king couldn't sleep, but the person who's thrown in the lion's den could sleep. Well, that tells me that, if you've got God in your life, that means no matter what trouble you may be going through, even if your life is on the line, you can still put your trust in Jesus. The song says, "'Tis so sweet to trust in Jesus." You can trust Jesus even when you're in the midst of a storm. And that's what we see in the story of Daniel. Daniel is able to rest. He's able to sleep. Who knows? He probably had a pillow, and the pillow was probably one of these lions. He had his head on a lion or something. But the king was tossing and turning. Those who have not put their trust in Jesus will not be able to experience the fullness of peace which God gives to those who put their trust in him. In Isaiah chapter 26 and verse 3, it says, great peace. No, that's in Psalms. It says, Isaiah 26:3. Does anybody remember? Great peace have they which love thy law, and nothing shall offend them. No, that's in Psalms. I'll look it up. Since you can't help me, I'll have to look it up. It says, you will keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on you. Because what? Because what? Because he trusts in you. And that's what happened. Because Daniel put his trust in the Lord, he was able to have peace. even in the midst of a storm, in the lion's den. So let's keep reading. It says in verse 19, then the king arose very early in the morning. The king arose early in the morning because obviously he'd been tossing and turning all night. He couldn't sleep. So at dawn, just before the break of day, he got up and went in haste to the den of lions. Verse 20, and when he came to the den, he cried out with a lamenting voice to Daniel. The king spoke, saying to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions? Verse 21, then Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, so that they have not hurt me, because I was found innocent before him, and also, O king, I have done no wrong before you. Throughout the story, this is the first time that Daniel actually speaks. He was falsely accused, and this law was made so that he ended up in the lion's den. But Daniel kept silent. He didn't speak to defend himself. He didn't say, King, but this is all a trap. This is all a farce. King, you know I've been faithful to you. He didn't say anything to defend himself. This is the first time that Daniel actually speaks. And he says, King, you know that I'm innocent. I haven't done anything wrong. I haven't offended you. And the king was excited. Verse 23 says, now the king was exceedingly glad. He was exceedingly glad for him and commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatever was found on him, because he believed in his God. And then it says in verse 24, and the king gave the command, and they brought those men who had accused Daniel, and they cast them into the lion's den, into the den of lions. Them, their children, their wives, and the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces before they ever came to the bottom of the den. Now, this is significant because oftentimes people say in the story, well, you know what? The lions don't really attack people when they're really well fed. These lions were not hungry. That's why they didn't attack Daniel. They were not hungry. Well, if they weren't hungry, well, it tells us that, these people who actually led Daniel into the lion's den, it says, even before they reached the bottom, their bones were broken. So obviously these lions must have been really hungry. So the angels, God sent an angel to protect Daniel in the lion's den. And then the king is so excited, then he actually makes a decree. He makes a decree saying that everybody in his kingdom should now respect and honor the God that Daniel serves. And Daniel is brought out of the lion's den. Now, this is significant because Daniel should have been eaten by the lions, but God spared his life. And maybe what can we say? What can we actually say about Daniel's life and this story that we've read? Well, the first thing that we can say is what I mentioned earlier, that prayer is essential for the Christian. Prayer is the life of the soul. Prayer is essential for the Christian life. You cannot live without breathing, and neither can you be a Christian without praying. Prayer is essential. This is how we get to know God. We get to share with God, and God speaks to us as well. The second point I'd like to say is that the promotion of Daniel in Babylon is proof that as a believer, you don't need to compromise in order to succeed. The fact that Darius promoted Daniel and wanted to make him prime minister of the whole kingdom tells us that as a believer, you do not need to compromise in order to be successful. Because oftentimes we're told, we need to cut a few corners and we need to, go with a dominant narrative and we need to conform. But what I'm learning from the story is this, that God can open a way for us if we're faithful to him. We can also learn, if we're faithful to God, then he's able to deliver us, even in an environment that is hostile to God. God can deliver us even in an environment that is hostile to him, as long as we are faithful. And so this is the story of Daniel. But there's one aspect that I thought we should also consider. And that is this. In Daniel chapter 6 and verse 6 to 9 that we read earlier, it says, give orders that in the next 30 days, any person who prays to anyone divine or human, except to you, your majesty, will be thrown into the den of lions. And now, your majesty, issue and sign this law so it cannot be changed. An official law of the Medes and the Persians that cannot be revoked. So King Darius signed the law. Now, what does that sound to you? Does that sound right? Imagine if the government today was to say, all right, today we're going to make a law that nobody should pray. Nobody's allowed to pray. And I'm making this law and I'm saying nobody is allowed to pray to anyone. Would that be right? You'd probably be concerned. And this is what religious liberty is about. Religious liberty is about allowing people to practice what they believe. Listen to what somebody says. This is one of the Catholic archbishops. And he says, who I pray to, how I pray, what I pray for, and most particularly who I pray with is not of concern to any government. Is the government going to tell us how to pray? How would you feel if the government told you how to pray, when to pray, who to pray to? That would not be right. And this is what this person is saying. And that's what we see in the book of Daniel. In the book of Daniel, the government decides to actually legislate or make laws regarding religion. And so, what is religious freedom? Religious freedom or religious liberty, in essence, is a principle that supports an individual or community to have or adopt and to manifest a belief in a teaching, practice, or observance in public or private without interference or coercion. Belief can be in a person, principle, or a thing. It includes carrying out practice in public or private, or both associated with such a belief, also known as worship. And it's synonymous with freedom of thought, opinion, expression, association, and peaceful assembly. So religious freedom is basically the government allowing people to worship, to believe what they believe, and to be able to practice what they believe. So two aspects to it. Basically, freedom of belief and freedom of practice. Now, this is essential because as Elder Johnny spoke about a few weeks ago, this becomes relevant, especially in the last days. In the last days, governments pass laws that make it difficult for God's people to worship. And that's what we see in the book of Daniel. So when we're reading the book of Daniel, these are not just stories just for entertainment, or these are just not stories recording history. These are stories reminding us that those who put their trust in God will always face a challenge, especially from the government. Because as you know, in Revelation chapter 12, verse 17, it says the dragon was wrought with a woman, meaning the church. Satan is angry with the church and goes to make war. And the way Satan or the dragon makes war with God's people is sometimes by passing laws that make it difficult for them to operate. And that's what we see here in the book of Daniel. And so religious freedom is a very important part of the work that we do to try and preserve our freedom, our rights to worship. And so if you look at the map on the screen, you discover that the places where it's deep orange or orange in color, these are places around the world where it's very difficult to practice your faith. So these are places where Christians are really going through a very difficult time. They're either being persecuted or living in a very hostile environment, and they're not allowed to practice their faith freely. So if you look, the first part, this is West Africa. In the northern part of Nigeria, Christians have been persecuted and they've gone through a lot of difficulty. And so there's hardly anybody up there who has probably not lost a family member because of religious freedom and persecution from extremists in that part of the world. If you look up north, up on the screen, you see countries like Libya, like Yemen, and even Sudan. These are countries where Christians are doing it tough. There's a list of countries where religious freedom, or where it is very difficult to practice your faith as a Christian. And it is usually published by Open Doors. And that's basically what it highlights. But I just thought I'd spell it out for you. So these are the countries where it is really difficult to practice your faith as a Christian. So you've got North Korea, you've got Somalia, you've got Yemen. In Somalia, obviously, the extremists are making it very difficult for Christians to operate. In North Korea, there's no religious freedom. In Yemen, because of the war and because of the dominant religion over there, some do persecute the Christians in that region. In Eritrea, there are only 2 or 3 denominations that are allowed to operate. And even that, there's a tight rein, or there's constant supervision on how they actually worship. And the Adventist Church is not one of those 3. And so in the past, some of our schools have been taken over by the government, and it's very difficult to operate. In Libya, the Christians there are doing it tough. Oftentimes, you get people migrating from the western part of Africa who are trying to get to Europe. And when they get there, sometimes the stories that you hear coming out of Libya is really bad. And so Christians there are struggling. And as I mentioned, the northern part of Nigeria. And in Pakistan, they got these laws called blasphemy laws. If you say something against, the dominant religion, that could and you could end up in trouble. So Christians there sometimes face discrimination. And of course, you've got Iran as well, similar situation, where the Christians, you're not allowed to convert somebody who is of the dominant religion. You're not allowed to convert somebody from that religion to your religion. And the church is actually operating underground in Iran. And of course, the situation in Afghanistan and also the war that is happening in Sudan. So if you imagine that you lived in one of these places, if you lived in one of these places where laws were against you as a Christian, how would you operate? Or maybe I should ask, what would you like the rest of Christendom or the rest of Christians in other parts of the world, how would you want them to relate to your situation? Well, this gentleman called Richard Wurmbrand from Romania, some of you know his story. He was actually, he said basically in Romania, he said to the communist government that communism and Christianity cannot coexist. And because of that, he was taken to prison. I think he spent about 14 years in prison before he was able to leave and left for the United States. This is what he says. He says, I tremble because of the sufferings of those persecuted in different lands. I tremble thinking about the eternal destiny of their torturers. I tremble for Western Christians who don't help their persecuted brethren. In the depth of my heart, I would like to keep the beauty of my own vineyard and not be involved in a huge fight. He goes on to say, I would like so much to be somewhere in quietness and rest, but it is not possible. The quietness and rest for which I long will be an escape from reality and dangerous for my soul. And then he says, what does he say? He says, the West sleeps and must be awakened to see the plight of the captive nations. The West sleeps and must be awakened to see the plight of captive nations. He's not only talking about the western part of the world, he's talking also about Western civilization, of which Australia is part. And so what are we doing to support our brothers and sisters who are being persecuted in these lands? Well, that's the question. And listen to what this theologian says about religious liberty, because oftentimes people say, well, it is for you religious people. He says religious freedom should not be begrudgingly permitted as much as enthusiastically embraced as a key mechanism for ensuring a free and fair multicultural democratic society. Even the irreligious have a vested interest in protecting the religious freedom of everyone. For if faith is open to coercion, so is non-faith. If faith is open to coercion, so is non-faith. So in other words, by advocating for religious freedom for all, you are actually preserving your own freedom, whether you're a believer or not. But what should we do for those who are being persecuted overseas? Well, I suggest that we pray for the nations. In Psalms chapter 2, verse 8, it says, ask of me, and I will give you the nations. I will give the nations for your inheritance, and the ends of the earth for your possession. Now, this text is talking about God giving the nations to the Messiah. But I think it still applies. If we can pray to God that, Lord, give us the nations that are being persecuted, the Christians over there. We're praying for these governments, that you touch their hearts. And Lord, that we're praying that all these people will come to know you. Pray for the nations. You remember John Knox? You remember what he said? He says what? Give me Scotland or what? Give me Scotland or I die. In other words, Lord, please give me Scotland. Give me the people of Scotland. I want them to become followers of Jesus. Give me Scotland or I die. So he was willing to die than to see these people lost. And that's the kind of passion that we need to be praying with. To be praying that God will rescue the nations. And Queen of Scots, her name was Mary, and I hear she said, I fear the prayers of John Knox more than all the assembled armies of Europe. Imagine. When is the last time the government says, well, I fear the prayers of Christians more than all the armies of all the powerful kingdoms in the world combined? I fear the prayers of John Knox more than all the armies of Europe. And I think if we make up our mind to actually intercede for those other nations, I think, our prayers will also be counted as those powerful prayers. Remember that in the book of Esther, there was a law that was passed that was going to wipe out all the Jews. And what did they do? Listen to what it says. Esther says, go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. That includes prayer. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. So Esther, again, was willing to actually die. She was willing to risk her life because she saw that there were people who were in need. And she decided to intercede and pray so that they could be saved. And I think we should do the same. Now, some of you remember this story. It says that the people came to Jesus and said to Jesus, Jesus, should we pay taxes to Caesar? You remember that? And Jesus said to them, give me a coin. So they gave Jesus a coin. And Jesus said to them, what is the image on the coin? And they said, well, it is Caesar's image. And then Jesus said, well, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. Give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and give to God what belongs to God. That's what Jesus said to them. Now, there are things that belong to Caesar. Like paying our taxes, making sure that, we're obeying the law as long as it does not contradict with the law of God. By being civil to each other. All those things we need to render to Caesar. But there are things that also belong to God. But another way to look at this is to think about the things that could actually belong to Caesar in the context of what we're talking about. And I'm suggesting to you, one of the things that we could be actually giving to Caesar or helping Caesar with is our prayers. Listen to what Paul says. In 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 1 to 2, he says, I urge then, first of all, that petitions, prayers, intercession, and thanksgiving be made for all people, for kings and all those in authority, that we may live peaceful and quiet lives in all godliness and holiness. So Paul here is talking about us doing what? He's asking us to what? To pray for kings and those in authority. And so when you lift up your voice and make your voice heard in heaven, remember to pray for the government so that we will continue to be able to worship freely. And those who are doing it tough, the countries that are shown, will also be able to worship in freedom. Elijah was a human being, even as we are. He prayed earnestly that it would not rain, and it did not rain on the land for 3.5 years. Again, he prayed, and the heavens gave rain, and the earth produced its crops. So Elijah was just like us, but yet when he prayed, God intervened, and this is what happened. Great Controversy, page 525, it says, it is part of God's plan to grant us in answer to the prayer of faith that which you would not bestow, did we not thus ask. Did you catch that? In other words, what God is saying is this. There are things that God will not do for us unless we do what? Unless we ask. So there are things that God is willing to do for us, and he's willing to do those things for us, but he's waiting for us to do what? Just to ask. That is part of his plan. When we ask, then he's able to deliver. And so the prayer points, maybe you want to do this for us, for these nations that I've mentioned. Pray for the nations, pray for our governments, pray for persecuted Christians, and pray for their salvation as well. So we saw this in the book of Daniel, how laws are passed to make it difficult for God's people. But as I was reading Daniel, as I was reading the story, it struck me that when you look at the story of Jesus, as you know, and look at what Daniel went through, sometimes you see similarities and sometimes you see ways in which Daniel behaved or in this story, and what happened to Jesus as well. For example, skip this. For example, it says, in Mark chapter 15, verse 10, it says, for he knew it was out of envy that the chief priests had handed Jesus over. When the chief priests brought Jesus to Pilate, it says Pilate knew that it was out of envy that they had brought Jesus to him. And that's exactly what happened in the story of Daniel, wasn't it? The people were envious of Daniel. They were envious that Daniel was going to be made the prime minister of the kingdom. Luke chapter 23, verse 4, it says, then Pilate said to the chief priests and the people, I find no fault in him. And is that not what we saw in the story of Daniel? The king couldn't find any fault in him. And Daniel himself said, King, I have not faulted you in any way. They couldn't find any fault in Daniel, and neither was any fault in Jesus. Pilate said to the people, I find no fault in him. Matthew chapter 27, verse 12 to 14 says, and while he was being accused by the chief priests and elders, he answered nothing. This is talking about Jesus. Then Pilate said to him, do you not hear how many things they testify against you? But he answered him not one word, so that the governor marveled greatly. Pilate argued with them because he wanted to release Jesus, but they kept shouting, crucify him, crucify him. So don't miss this. Yeah, I'm going to hurt. Jesus answered nothing. Just like Daniel answered nothing. He didn't say anything. He just kept quiet. And that's exactly what we see with Jesus. And then it says that Pilate wanted to release Jesus. Remember the king in the story. He says he labored from morning till night, trying to find a way to release Daniel. but he wasn't successful. He wasn't successful because God was reserving the right for himself. God was reserving the honor for himself. And maybe I can add this. Sometimes, we're trying to solve problems on our own. Sometimes we're trying to figure out ways in order to be able to get through our problems. And we try and we fail, we try and we fail, we try and we fail. Maybe it is because maybe God is reserving the honor for himself. And he's the only one who's going to act to bring you through that. So the honor and the glory comes to him. In Matthew chapter 27, verse 65 to 66, it says, Pilate said to them, you have a God, go your way, make it as secure as you know how. So they went and made the tomb secure, sealing the stone and setting the guard. The story of Daniel, remember the lion's den, and the stone that was placed before the lion's den was sealed. And that's exactly what we saw, what we see in the story of Jesus. And then it says in Mark, very early in the morning, that's exactly the time that the king woke up. It says very early in the morning, the king went to the lion's den. Very early in the morning, on the first day of the week, they came to the tomb when the sun had risen. And they said among themselves, who will roll away the stone from the door of the tomb for us? But when they looked up, they saw that the stone had been rolled away, for it was very large. The stone from the door of the tomb, the stone that was used to close the lion's den. The stone. And as I'm speaking, some of you have stones in your life. Maybe some small stones, medium-sized stones, and some large stones in your life. And you're probably wondering to yourself, who is going to roll this stone away from my life? I'm talking about your problems, our problems, the stones in your life. Now, some things that are hard to crack, some things that you're trying to solve that you cannot solve. You're hitting your head against the brick wall, as they say. It is tough and it is hard. And you're asking yourself, who's going to roll this stone away from the tomb for me? Well, it says in verse 4, when they looked up, the stone had been rolled away. So maybe instead of looking to your friends, instead of looking to your own intelligence, instead of looking to your own scheming and devising to try and solve the problem, maybe we need to look up. Because when we look up, that's where our help will come from. Psalm 121 says, I'll lift up mine eyes unto the hills. From whence comes my help? My help comes to the Lord who made heaven and earth. It says, and entering the tomb, they saw a young man clothed in a long white robe, sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, do not be alarmed. You see Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He is risen. He's not here. See the place where they laid him. Jesus rose from the grave. He was put in the tomb. He was killed on the cross, put in the tomb, and they expected him to stay in the tomb and rot. But when the woman went there that morning, what happened? It says, he is risen. And that's exactly what we see in the story of Daniel. He was put in a den to die. But in the morning, he came out alive. He is risen. He is risen indeed. So before I sit down, maybe I have a simple question. How's your relationship with Jesus? How's your relationship with Jesus? Because we can talk about religious liberty. Or we can talk about the prayer life of Daniel. We can talk about the fact that he did not compromise and was faithful. So much so the king said, your God whom you serve continually, he will deliver you. But it's one thing to talk about somebody else. It's one thing to talk about a topic. But it's something else when you have to question yourself and answer the question, how is my relationship with God? Do you have a friend called Jesus, who you can share with, who you can trust, who you can confess all your sins to and have a conversation with? In the story of Daniel, we're encouraged to put our trust in God. For the God that we serve continually, he's the one who will be able to deliver us. Amen.